The rain poured gently outside the small diner window. James sat alone in a corner booth, watching droplets race down the glass. It was supposed to be an ordinary lunch, just him, his meal, and his thoughts. But that quiet moment was about to change his life forever. Just as he picked up his fork, he heard a trembling voice behind him. "Sir, my son's hungry. Can we stay a while?" He turned, and what he saw next he would never forget. The soft patter of rain drummed against the window of a small, forgotten diner on the edge of town. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of brewed coffee and toasted bread, a quiet refuge from the gray afternoon outside. James sat alone in his usual corner booth, the one near the window where he could watch the world pass without ever really being a part of it. It had been almost a year since his wife passed away. Since then, silence had become his closest companion. Every day felt the same. Wake up, go to work, eat alone, go home. He wasn't angry at life anymore, just tired. The kind of tired that seeps into your bones, where even small joys feel like distant echoes. He stirred his coffee slowly, watching the tiny whirlpool form and fade, the cream blending like the days blending into one another. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, placed his usual order in front of him. Soup and bread, simple and warm. "Here you go, hun," she said softly. James nodded, offering a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. She knew better than to ask questions. Some people, she'd learned, carried their grief in silence. The diner hummed with quiet life. A couple sharing a laugh in the back, an old man reading a newspaper, a teenage boy mopping the floor near the counter. It was ordinary, but to James, that ordinariness was comforting, predictable, safe. The same faces, the same smells, the same seat. It was the one place where time seemed to slow down, where he didn't have to explain the emptiness he carried inside. He looked out the window. The rain had begun to fall harder, people rushing by with umbrellas, cars hissing through puddles. He wondered how many of them were going home to someone, a wife, a child, a friend. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had dinner with anyone. The chair across from him had stayed empty for months, and yet he always kept it clean. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of hope. As he lifted the spoon to his mouth, a thought crossed his mind, the same one that often did. This is fine. I'm fine. Alone is easier. But even as he told himself that, something deep inside whispered that it wasn't true. He missed the sound of laughter across the table, the feeling of being seen, the warmth of simple connection. The bell above the diner door jingled softly, snapping him from his thoughts. A gust of cool air swept in, followed by the faint shuffle of hesitant footsteps. He didn't look up right away. To him, it was just another customer, another person seeking warmth from the rain. He took a sip of his coffee and stared out at the drenched world beyond the glass. He had no idea that within the next few minutes, everything he believed about loneliness, kindness, and connection was about to change forever. The diner door opened again, and this time James looked up. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of wet pavement and something else: desperation. Standing in the doorway was a young woman drenched from the rain. Her hair clung to her face, her thin jacket soaked through. In one hand she held a small plastic bag. In the other, the hand of a little boy no older than 6. The boy's shoes were muddy, his clothes slightly too big, and his eyes, large, curious, and innocent, scanned the room like he wasn't sure if they were supposed to be there. The mother hesitated for a moment, glancing around the diner, perhaps searching for a familiar face or a bit of kindness. Most people looked away, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what to do. James lowered his gaze to his plate, unsure why he suddenly felt uneasy. He wasn't a man used to strangers interrupting his solitude, but something about the pair lingered in his mind. The way the mother held her son close, trying to shield him from the cold, reminded him of something long buried, the memory of his own wife holding their child years ago, before life had taught him what it meant to lose. The waitress approached them, her expression kind but cautious. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" she asked gently. The mother's voice was soft, trembling with the weight of humility. I'm sorry. We just need a place to stay dry for a bit. My son's hungry." Her words were polite, almost apologetic, as if asking for warmth and food was a privilege she hadn't earned. James looked up again. Their eyes met, hers filled with quiet desperation, his with hesitant empathy. Something stirred inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Before he could stop himself, he spoke. "You can sit here," he said, motioning toward the empty seat across from him. His voice came out lower than he expected, but steady. The woman blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "Are you sure?" she asked. He nodded. "Please. You both look like you could use a warm meal." Relief washed over her face, and for the first time James saw her smile. Small and tired, but genuine. She guided her son to the booth, and the little boy climbed onto the seat, his legs barely reaching the floor. "Say thank you," she whispered to him. "Thank you, sir," the boy said shyly, his voice almost musical. James smiled, something warm flickering inside his chest. "You're welcome," he replied softly. As the waitress brought them water and extra napkins, James studied the scene quietly. The boy reached for the cup with both hands, sipping carefully as his mother brushed rain from his hair. It was such a simple, ordinary moment, yet somehow it felt extraordinary. In that small act, offering a seat, sharing a table, something had shifted. The empty booth that had once mirrored his loneliness now held new life, new meaning. For the first time in months, James didn't feel alone, and as he looked at the little boy smiling faintly through his hunger, he realized that kindness doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, it enters quietly through a trembling voice asking, "Can my son join you?" The waitress returned a few minutes later, placing a steaming bowl of soup and a plate of bread in front of the mother and her son. "It's on the house," she said softly, giving James a knowing glance. The mother hesitated, unsure whether to accept, but the boy's eyes lit up at the sight of warm food. "Go on," James said, nodding toward the plate. "Eat while it's hot." The little boy looked at his mother for permission. She smiled faintly and gave a small nod. With that, he tore into the bread, carefully dipping it into the soup. James watched as the boy's expression changed, from hunger to relief, from relief to joy. That small transformation stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The mother wiped her son's hands gently with a napkin, whispering, "Slow down, sweetheart." Then she looked across the table at James. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do this." James shrugged, pretending it was nothing. "It's just a meal." But it wasn't just a meal. Not to him, not anymore. As they ate, the tension slowly faded, replaced by an unexpected ease. The boy began to talk. Not much at first, but enough to make James smile. "My name's Lucas," he said proudly between bites. "I like airplanes." James leaned forward. "Airplanes, huh? You want to fly them someday?" Lucas nodded, his face lighting up. "Yes, I want to be a pilot, so I can take my mom anywhere she wants to go." The mother laughed softly, her eyes glistening. "He's been saying that ever since he saw one fly over our house. We live near the bus station, so we see them sometimes." James smiled, and for a moment he forgot the weight he'd been carrying. The sound of their laughter filled the empty space inside him that had been silent for too long. He learned that her name was Maria, that she had been working at a small laundry shop before it closed down. They'd been struggling since then, moving between temporary shelters while she looked for work. "It's been hard," she admitted softly, "but I keep telling Lucas that good people still exist." James looked down at his coffee, feeling a lump form in his throat. He thought about his own son, about how much he missed those days when life was simple, when laughter at the dinner table was enough to make everything feel right. Without thinking, he slid his untouched plate of bread toward the boy. "Here," he said. "You can have mine too." Maria shook her head. "You've done enough already." But James smiled gently. "Please. It's been a long time since I've seen someone enjoy a meal this much. Let me." The boy looked up at him, his mouth full, and said, "You're really nice, mister." James chuckled, his eyes misting. "No, kid. I'm just lucky to have company." In that diner, surrounded by strangers and rain, three people who had nothing in common shared something far greater than food. They shared warmth, dignity, and a moment of genuine connection. For James, it was the first time in months that the silence in his heart had been replaced, not by words, but by something far more powerful. Kindness. The diner had grown quieter as the evening wore on. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, tapping softly against the windows. Inside, the warm glow of the hanging lamps wrapped the small booth in a cocoon of calm. The plates were nearly empty now, and the boy leaned against his mother's arm, half asleep. James stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, watching the steam rise and curl into the dim air. Something inside him was shifting, quietly but profoundly. He hadn't planned on talking to anyone that night. He hadn't planned on feeling anything at all. But now, sitting across from this woman and her son, he felt human again. Maria smiled faintly as she brushed crumbs off the table. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Her voice was soft, carrying both gratitude and weariness. "Most people wouldn't have even looked our way." James shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. I should be thanking you." She looked confused. "For what?" He hesitated, then exhaled deeply. "For reminding me that I'm still capable of caring." Her expression softened. "You've lost someone," she said quietly. It wasn't a question, just an understanding. James looked down, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "My wife and my son. A car accident 3 years ago. After that, I just stopped trying. Stopped talking to people. I used to come here with them." This was our spot. Maria's eyes glistened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain outside seemed to echo his silence, gentle but unrelenting. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. James nodded, swallowing hard. "You know, I used to think I'd never feel connected to anyone again. That the world had already taken everything worth caring about. But tonight," he paused, his voice breaking slightly. "Tonight I realized it's still possible. To care, to help, to feel something good again." Maria reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Her touch was light but steady, an unspoken thank you, an acknowledgement of shared pain and survival. "You did more than feed us," she said softly. "You reminded me that kindness still lives in this world." For the first time in years, James smiled, not out of politeness but out of something real. He looked at the sleeping boy and felt a surge of warmth. Maybe this encounter wasn't random. Maybe it was something meant to happen. Two broken souls crossing paths to remind each other that compassion still exists. The waitress came by with the check, but James slid his card across before Maria could protest. "Don't worry about it," he said gently. As they stood to leave, Maria looked at him one last time. "You've given us more than dinner tonight," she said. "You've given us hope." James watched as they stepped out into the quiet night. The rain had stopped, the streetlights reflecting in the puddles like stars scattered on the ground. And for the first time in a long time, James didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing on his chest. He felt light, because in that small act of kindness, a shared table, a meal, a simple conversation, he had found something he thought he'd lost forever: the healing power of human connection. The rain had finally stopped. The world outside the diner glistened under the streetlights, reflections of amber and gold dancing in the puddles. Inside, the air still carried the warmth of coffee and quiet gratitude. Maria wrapped her scarf around her son, who had drifted into a light sleep against her shoulder. James stood, his coat slung over his arm, unsure of what to say. There was a heaviness in the moment. Not sadness exactly, but that tender ache that comes when something meaningful is about to end. "Thank you again," Maria said softly. "For everything. For the meal. And for treating us like we mattered," James smiled gently. "You do matter. Don't ever think you don't." She looked down, her eyes glistening. "People don't usually see us that way." "Well," he said, his voice steady, "maybe tonight will remind them that kindness doesn't need reasons." Maria nodded, clutching her son's small hand. They started toward the door, but just before she stepped outside, she turned back. "James," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't have much, but please take this." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small paper crane folded carefully from a torn napkin. It was delicate, simple, but beautiful. "Lucas made it while we were waiting for the bus this morning," she explained. "He said it brings good luck." James stared at it, at the tiny creases, the careful folds, and felt a lump rise in his throat. He took it gently, holding it as if it were made of glass. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll keep it safe." Maria smiled, a soft, tired smile that carried both gratitude and farewell. Then she stepped outside, her son's hand in hers, disappearing into the night. James stood by the window watching them walk away. The little boy turned once, waving through the glass. James raised his hand and waved back. The diner was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. The booth that once held his loneliness now carried a story, a memory of kindness shared between strangers who had found comfort in each other's company. He sat back down, the paper crane still in his palm. He set it on the table beside his coffee and looked at it for a long time. It wasn't just a paper bird. It was a symbol of something reborn inside him. Hope. The waitress walked by, giving him a warm smile. "That was a kind thing you did tonight," she said. James shook his head. "They did more for me than I did for them." As he stepped outside, the cold air met his face, crisp and refreshing. He looked up at the cloudy night sky. The rain had cleared just enough for a few stars to peek through. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace. He tucked the paper crane into his coat pocket and whispered to himself, "Maybe tomorrow. I'll have someone to share breakfast with, too." It wasn't just a meal that changed his night. It was a moment that rekindled his belief in humanity. Because sometimes all it takes is one small act of kindness to remind us that we're never truly alone in this world.